Hello, and welcome to the course. I'm your host today, Stephen, and I'm speaking with Professor Adom Getachew from the Department of Political Science. Professor Getachew is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. She holds a joint PhD in Political Science and African American Studies from Yale University and is on the faculty board of the Posen Center for Human Rights, a fellow at the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. She's also the author of World Making After Empire: The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. She's here to talk to us today about her career path and how she became a University of Chicago professor. Professor Getachew, it is great to have you. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I want to get into your story and how you got to Chicago, but really quickly at the top, could you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your position and what you teach and research now?
Great. Yes, I'm a professor in the political science department, and within political science, I specialize in political theory, and I study questions of race and imperialism. I look at Black political thought, so a set of African, and Caribbean thinkers from the late 19th to the early 20th century, and the ways they thought about questions of racial hierarchy and imperial rule and possibilities for emancipation.
Okay, thank you. So how would you explain that to a layperson? I mean, like, did you have like a one or two sentence sort of summary of like what your focus has been over your career?
I guess so. I examine the kind of history of European imperial rule, primarily focused on the 19th and 20th century. But of course, that's an experience that begins really in the 15th century. And that process of European imperial expansion coincided, of course, with the slave trade. It coincided with the emergence and elaboration of theories of racial difference and racial hierarchy. And I look at a set of Black thinkers from around the world who theorized and analyzed and critiqued those systems of imperial rule and racial hierarchy. And especially in the 20th century, they would come to defend visions of self-determination. So projects that were intended to secure both racial equality and independence from imperial rule.
Okay, thank you. So we've been asking everyone about their sort of middle and high school years, what they were like, and specifically if there are any sort of signs back then that this is the field that you would go into. So I mean, in your case, I'd like to just hear a little bit about your background as well, because I know that you emigrated to the U.S. around that period. So could you tell us a little bit about that journey, and were there any sort of inklings that you were going to go down this road when you were that age?
So yes, I was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I grew up in Addis Ababa and in Gaborone, Botswana, until I was about 13 years old, and moved to Arlington, Virginia around that time. And that was 2001. And I started high school shortly after in the United States. So I would say at that time, there really weren't many inclinations that this would be the direction I was going to head into. Mm-hmm. But I had a very formative experience as a sophomore in high school. I didn't know what I was going to do or what I was going to be, but my counselor at the time suggested I attend a summer program at Howard University in Washington, D.C. For those who don't know, Howard University is a historically Black college, one of the most prominent Black universities in the United States. And the summer program was focused on international relations and international law. And it was sort of set up kind of like a model UN, but I took, classes, had debates and discussions with that were run by primarily graduate students and included, high school students from across the DC area. So that was a formative experience in two senses. One, it was the first kind of college campus I had in the United States I'd been to. Two, it, kind of alerted me to international politics. And I didn't realize this at the time, but, Howard University would become a really important part of my own research, because some of the thinkers that I study in the 20th century spent time at Howard, would develop some of their kind of analyses of global politics while they were either faculty or students at Howard. So retrospectively, it would become an important site. But at that time, a lot of my interest was really in participating in international politics. So I thought I might work for the United Nations or work in development agencies. So that was sort of the orientation I had when I went to college at the University of Virginia. And while there, I think I was drawn very much to the work of some of my faculty, especially in African American studies. So I found myself being really interested in just delving deeper into the realm of ideas. And I had an opportunity after my junior year in college to attend a summer research program where I spent a summer at Yale and did independent research with the kind of mentorship of a faculty member there.
Interesting. One of our questions was going to be, who are some people who have impacted the trajectory of your career? Could you talk a little bit more about that experience and how it impacted it?
Yeah, I think the most important set of faculty members who initially, suggested the kind of trajectory of graduate school to me were my faculty advisors at UVA. And they included quite a, array of faculty. So Claudrina Harold in the history department, who studies African-American history, Corey Walker, who is a religious studies scholar, but broadly studied African-American political thought, Robert Fatton, who's a scholar of African politics, and Laurie Balfour, who is a political theorist. So this group of 4 faculty really encouraged me to think about graduate school and encouraged me to do this research program that I was talking about doing in the summer of my junior year. And their kind of influence and model of teaching and scholarship really was for me a kind of opened up a window of thinking, oh, this is something I could do. And I would like to be, I would like to play the role they played in my life, which was kind of, opening my eyes to whole new ways of thinking, helping me understand the world I lived in a really different kind of way. And so that was a really important and kind of formative experience in my journey towards, pursuing a PhD.
Yeah, I see. Would you say that was the moment when you decided, when you set your sights on academia, or were there any other experiences or just sort of like an aha moment when you decided to follow that path?
I think another aha moment for me was I spent one summer working on Capitol Hill for the Congressional Black Caucus, and where, some of my work connected to the relationship of the caucus to various African states, in particular Liberia at the time. And, so if there was the pull factor of the model of my advisors, and then there was the push factor of not actually liking politics or the realm of DC politics. So I think there were so I that summer was really interesting, but for me it was a kind of eye-opening about what a life in the realm of at least congressional politics was, and it just wasn't very appealing to me. And I found myself much more interested in doing the kind of random reading that I was doing at my desk at lunchtime than I was in the work that I was doing, or the kinds of discussions and debates we were having within the office I worked in. So I think that experience was also just I realized in that time that, I like doing this kind of independent writing and thinking more than I do working in an office and, dealing with the various dramas of the kind of DC politics. And that was, before things got really crazy. So I don't know what it's like now.
One can only imagine. So, okay, you mentioned the reading that you were doing at lunch and in your free time being more interesting. How did you arrive at the focus that you've followed throughout your academic career?
That's a really good question. I mean, so The one text I was reading during my lunch breaks was Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And for those who don't know, Fanon is a Martinican psychiatrist who is trained in France, but he goes on to join the National Liberation Movement in Algeria, a French colony. Martinique was also a French colony at the time. And he writes this important book, The Wretched of the Earth, that's a kind of defense of kind of revolutionary violence in Algeria, but against imperialism more generally. I think, it's probably for many students, it would be one of the first kind of examples of anti-imperial or anti-colonial texts they would read, and it was for me. And I ended up actually writing an undergraduate thesis on Fanon. And so that was my kind of entry point into thinking about decolonization or the end of imperialism, thinking about different theories and imaginations of what kind of, the end of empire or what independence and equality could look like. So that would end up being my kind of focus for my dissertation also, although Frantz Fanon would no longer play an important role in that work, but I was still preoccupied with that period of, let's say, the immediate post-World War II years from, let's say, 1945 to about 1975. Mm-hmm. This was a period in which, like the membership in the UN in the United Nations goes from about 50 states to, more than double that as all these states are gaining independence. So I ended up studying a series of African and Caribbean thinkers in this period and how they thought about this concept, this principle, self-determination, the idea that, all peoples have the right to self-rule. And so I was trying to think through what that meant and how they imagined and institutionalized that principle.
Okay, so has your academic research involved a lot of travel and a lot of research abroad?
Yeah, so my first book, which was focused on this period and this context of decolonization, involved archival research in many different places, in Trinidad and Barbados, in Ghana, in the United Kingdom, and also in Switzerland. And what I was doing in these places primarily was looking up various kind of documents, some of them written material by the actors I was studying, some of them kind of official debates and discussions, constitutional debates and discussions between states, etc. So official documents and also more private or personal documents, which were really important to my research. Another thing I did while in these contexts, especially in Trinidad and in Ghana, was a series of, very informal kind of interviews, conversations. Like, interviews aren't really part of my method, but it was just important to meet a set of actors, some of whom had played really important roles in the period I was interested in, and as well as some academics who were based in these countries, who were just really helpful interlocutors as I shaped my questions and framed my dissertation topic.
And I wanted to just sort of jump back a little bit because one question that the university wants to ask is, just have you worked in non-academic settings and how has that influenced your work? You talked about the push and pull factor. I don't know, was there anything else from your time, like away from university campuses, that you feel has informed your work since then? Or have you held other roles outside of academia?
No. So I went straight from undergrad to graduate school and from graduate school straight to Chicago. So I'm, a person who's spent my kind of entire adult life on a college campus in some way or form. I will say for those who, are thinking about pursuing the academy, pursuing higher education, I would say I always advise students not to do what I did. I think it's important to have more, even if you ultimately end up pursuing a PhD and wanting to be an academic, it's worth pursuing and having experiences that are more than just one summer in DC before kind of deciding on that track. So I think that those can be really useful. And when I was in graduate school, many of my colleagues and cohort mates, had done really a wide array of things before they came to graduate school. And I think that can have really great effects on the research you do. It can inform the kind of questions you're asking in ways that are really important.
Yeah, and on that note, what other advice would you have for someone who wanted to follow in your footsteps or enter your field?
I would say read widely, right? Which may seem very obvious, but I think I have found it always important to read beyond the specific, disciplinary location that I'm in. So the work of historians has been really important for me. Right now, the work of literary and cultural studies scholars is really important to me. So I think it's there's a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity, but I think like interdisciplinarity for me means really trying to cultivate a reading practice that's question driven. So you're interested in a topic or a problem in the world, and you read in such a way that you can see varieties of perspectives on it. That's one thing I would suggest. I think another thing I would suggest is conversations with people who are differently positioned within the university setting can be really useful. Like, getting a sense of various trajectories of how people got to where they got to, how they arrived at their questions can be really instructive. I found those kinds of conversations when I was an undergrad to be really useful. One other thing I might add is try not to chase what you think is a important topic or the hot topic, right? Like really, this, if you end up pursuing this work, you have to be kind of dedicated to it in a long-term kind of way. So it has to be something that really moves and motivates you. And then you'll have to figure out how to translate that so that other people are moved and motivated by it as well. But I think it's really important to start from the kind of intuitions you have.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask about, just how you find support, how you manage to surround yourself with a support team, and how you deal with, I don't know, criticism, resistance, just sort of, roadblocks along your career path.
Yeah, that's a great question. In various ways, I think like the academic work, especially in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, is a very lonely endeavor, right? Like you go to the archive and you sift through many, many boxes of old papers, and hopefully you find something and then you go write about it by yourself, right? So it can be a very singular and isolated activity. But I think that what I have found is that actually it may be that ultimately you are responsible for what's on the paper, but having a community of scholars around you is a really important. And I think it's important to think about that at different levels. So, I think and I have like mentors who are much more senior than me, right? And they help me think about like how to think about the next steps of my career and help me plan ahead for those kinds of endeavors. I have kind of mentors or peers who are, closer into the process as I am. And I think of them as like people I'm navigating the road with. And so they're the people who, are in a way that like, for more senior people, the everyday experiences of like a junior faculty member are not going to be super top of mind, but there are people who have either recently gone through that experience or are going through that experience in the same period as you are. And those can just be about like troubleshooting, right? Like I'm running into this kind of problem or this kind of conundrum. What do you think? Or I'm applying to this grant. I know you got it, last year or 2 years ago. Could I take a look at your materials? So that kind of peer-to-peer network is really important. And I tell graduate students, who come to UChicago this all the time. The thing that changes from being an undergrad to being a graduate student is that in undergrad, the learning is very much your professor teaches you things, and it's a kind of, vertical pedagogical relationship.
Mhm.
Beginning in graduate school, like peer-to-peer learning, or is a horizontal pedagogy is as much as important, perhaps more important than what you learn from your faculty members. And also your relationship to your faculty members is also one that's kind of evolving into a peer-to-peer relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great insights. Wanted to ask a little bit about your everyday experiences. What are some fun things about your current role, and is there anything about your current work or just your current responsibilities that may not be so fun that you don't particularly care for?
I think the thing I enjoy most about teaching is and being a professor here is helping students kind of go on their own research journeys. So, for instance, yesterday I had an undergraduate student who's thinking about a senior thesis come in, and broadly he wants to think about caste politics in India, and he has like it's a big topic, right? And helping him think about how he would go from this really big concern and interest into something like more manageable and a narrow question that he could really dig into for the next, year or so and produce a senior thesis. And so both like having that kind of conversation and then seeing students through that process and end up like producing, excellent senior theses or dissertations, award-winning dissertations, is really like one of the great joys of this job. And it's not only because I it's like you're kind of like a proud parent or something. You're seeing your students being successful, but because many of those projects end up being projects that I learn a lot from, actually. Also, like it helps me think in different ways about my own work. And I find that is true of the classroom at its best also, that even when I'm teaching texts that I've read many times, I've written about, I find that the kinds of conversations I have with students in the classroom really can bring new perspectives and surprising perspectives. So I really enjoy that. And it's another indication of the ways that actually scholarship is always a collaborative endeavor, right? Where we're building on long kind of traditions of scholarship. We're constantly in conversation with students, with colleagues, and that all ends up kind of shaping the work that we do. What don't I like about the job? Honestly, the worst part of the job is grading. So
Yeah.
partly because I enjoy giving feedback to students, especially on writing and helping them become better writers. But I often find the assigning of grades a very torturous experience.
Mhm.
I think the students often find the same too. So it's not my favorite. It's not my favorite thing. I think the other thing I would say is that Chicago is it's a very decentralized place, which in some ways is wonderful. It means that for every kind of intellectual interest or curiosity you have, there is a place and a home for you at the university. But it also can mean that you're really stretched very thin, right? And especially this time of year, April, May, as the weather gets warmer, there's like, everyone kind of schedules their events, their conferences, their talks for this period. So it's a moment where you feel incredibly stretched. And I wish there were ways that were less the case.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you for taking the time in the middle of this busy season to talk with us. You actually may already have answered our last question, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. That's just what is the most gratifying thing you do? What do you find the most gratifying of in your work?
I think, in addition to sort of the work I was talking about advising students and seeing them kind of realize their research projects, I think the most gratifying thing is not necessarily changing students' minds, because I don't really think that's, I don't think of that as my kind of aim, but more like opening them up to new perspectives. I think there's a time in some classes, it doesn't always happen, but when, students have this kind of bright-eyed like moment of realization or kind of something has opened up for them, whether it's like we're reading a really difficult text or they're kind of making a connection between a past event and a contemporary kind of debate, that just kind of an aha moment. And when I said, earlier that I wanted to kind of do the thing that my professors did for me, like that's what they did for me, right? It just like opened my eyes up to a whole way of seeing the world that I hadn't had before. So those moments feel very special to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming and sharing all of this. We have just about a minute left, unless, in case there is anything else you wanted to discuss. Is there any other aspect of your work or research that you would like to touch on here, or do you think we've covered it?
I guess more related to research, I would just say I do a lot of archival work, as I mentioned, which can be sometimes a slog. And when you find a rare gem or you begin to realize a pattern, it's the most exciting thing. So over the last few months, for instance, I've spent a lot of time reading through these early 20th century newspapers from West Africa, from what was called British West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. And, I was just trying to think about when kind of West African writers begin to use the category of Black, or in that period Negro, and why they were kind of beginning to use this term to self-identify, becoming like just reading newspaper after newspaper every week and finally being able to kind of map a pattern. Like in some ways, like in my research, this is the kind of equivalent of the aha moment that I was talking about for the classroom.
Yeah, I almost asked for an example of that earlier, so I'm glad that we ended up getting one on the tape here. Yeah, Professor Getachew, thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, really appreciate you coming and sharing all this.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen.
And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other episodes of the podcast. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. See you around.